Imagine, just for a minute, that you're a young cavalryman. The sun is shining, you're thirsty and a bit hungry. It's been a few hours since that rushed cup of coffee when you woke up. You're bored. The majority of the column to which you were attached has already marched away looking for battle, leaving your unit and a few others to pack up the camp and chase away a few enemy stragglers. You spot a few Zulus on a hill nearby and decide to give chase. You spur your horse forward and check the state of your carbine. Perhaps you'll get to fire a shot or two today after all. The small group of enemy warriors scatter as you approach, but as you follow them over the brow of the hill, you see something shocking, the most terrifying sight of your life. You suddenly feel sick, your heart pounding hard, a bead of sweat running down your temple that you don't even notice. Arrayed in front of you is a vast sea of Zulus, over 20,000 of them. All their eyes slowly turn to you. Your bowels begin to liquefy as you realise that you're no longer the hunter. The Zulus have the initiative. They've outmaneuvered and outthought your commanding officer, and you might be about to pay the price. The Battle of Isandlwana, fought on the 22nd of January 1879, is one of the most discussed and written about engagements in the history of the British Army. We British do love a glorious defeat, and the battle certainly falls into that category. It's a difficult battle for the historian though, disjointed and confused, with few first-hand accounts to help us. As historian Keith Smith says, Isandlwana is the most impenetrable engagement to comprehend because all of the major European participants lost their lives. Had Colonel Durnford, Lieutenant Colonel Poulain, or even Lieutenant Melville survived, then the story of the events of that dreadful day would now be easier to tell. But they didn't, and it is thus no accident that this battle engages us still. So welcome to episode 2 of the Redcoat History Podcast with me, Christian Parkinson. I'm a filmmaker, photographer and battlefield explorer who has a passion for the history of the British Army, a passion that I'm desperate to share with you. I've spent years travelling to far-flung places to visit long-forgotten graves and to walk in the footsteps of heroes. The more remote or the more obscure the campaign, the more I want to visit and remember the men who took part. This podcast is my attempt to help keep the memories alive and hopefully spark an interest in military history for a new generation. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the Redcoat History Podcast. In episode 1, also released today, we looked at the reasons for war and the state of the British and Zulu armies. If you haven't listened, then it's definitely worth doing so to gain a deeper understanding of the background to this battle and the British invasion of Zululand. Planning for the invasion, Lord Chelmsford, the commander of the British troops in southern Africa, had wanted to concentrate his forces for one big push on the Zulu capital, Ulundi. But the fear was that such a column would be too unwieldy and move too slowly. It would be difficult to draw the Zulu impi into battle with such a powerful force, and so there was every possibility that the Zulus would simply ignore it and instead attack across the border into Natal. With this fear in mind, Chelmsford decided to divide his force into a number of smaller columns that would all move towards Ulundi from different directions. Originally he had hoped to utilise 5 columns, but he lacked the manpower and the transport infrastructure. He was forced to reduce the number to 3. In the south would be a coastal column, or number 1 column under Colonel Pearson, a former battalion commander in the Buffs who had been called out of retirement. Under him were the 2nd Battalion of his old regiment, as well as a naval brigade consisting of 170 sailors and marines from HMS Active. The Jackdaws were armed with 2 12-pounders and a Gatling gun. The plan was for them to advance to Eshowe and set up a supply depot before heading for Ulundi. Meanwhile, the Northern Column, commanded by Colonel Evelyn Wood and including the 90th Regiment and the 1st Battalion of the 13th Regiment, as well as 4 guns from the artillery, were to advance from Bemba's Cop. But it's the Centre Column, or number 3 column, that we'll be focusing on today. Commanding the Central Column was, on paper at least, Colonel Richard Thomas Glynn, commanding officer of the 1st Battalion 24th Foot. In a caricature sketched of him at the time of the war, he looks like an old naval man with a bushy white beard, his jaw thrust forward and a pipe sticking out of his mouth. He was in his late 40s and had been in the army since 1850. He'd fought in the Crimea with the 82nd Regiment and had served a long spell in India. In 1867 he'd purchased the lieutenant colonelcy of the 1st 24th and a few years later had been promoted full colonel. But Lord Chelmsford and his staff had decided to attach themselves to the centre column, meaning that Glynn was subordinate to them, removing most of his operational responsibility. From the middle of December, the tough, battle-hardened men of Glynn's battalion had been gathering at a place called Helpmachar on the Zululand border, an insignificant tiny settlement which was to be their base before the invasion. It was a wet, miserable time for the men, who tried their best to stay healthy and keep their rifle practice in order, despite the constant thunderstorms. Commandant Hamilton Brown of the Natal Native Contingent, who we met in episode 1, explains how terrible the storms were that summer as he and his colleague travelled to find their new command. We entered the cart and started gaily on our way. But before we arrived at our destination, and just as we had reached the bare top of a high hill, we were struck by the most terrific thunderstorm I have ever had to face. The driver lost his head, the 6 mules maddened by the vivid lightning, and the lashing hail became unmanageable. We had to jump out and rush to their heads. The force of the wind overturned the cart, and for at least 20 minutes, if ever 2 men on this earth smelt hell, it was Lonsdale and I. I had experienced as heavy squalls of wind before, and since then have seen hailstones pierce corrugated iron roofs like rifle bullets. But I have never before or since seen such lightning, and certainly never want to again. It seemed as if we were enveloped by continuous electric flashes that came so quickly one after the other as to be continuous, and so close to us that if one of us had let go his grip on the mule's head collars, he could have dabbled his hand in liquid flames. Nor could we use our hands to shelter our eyes, as we had to hang on to the mules, and the skin on my face seemed to grow hot and blister, as if old Nick was shaving me with the spearhead he wears at the end of his tail. Brilliant description, if perhaps slightly over the top. I've lived in South Africa a number of years and seen some horrific thunderstorms, but nothing that made me feel the devil was shaving me. At Helpmachar, a number of small colonial mounted units soon arrived, including the Natal Carbiners, the Newcastle Mounted Rifles, the Buffalo Border Guards, and over 100 men of the Natal Mounted Police. Just before Christmas, the 2nd Battalion of the 24th also turned up. It was the first time the 2 battalions were to campaign side by side. These young men had performed well in the 9th Frontier War and looked like a fine body of men, despite being mainly short-service volunteers who had only been in the army for a few years. There was also a contingent of the Royal Artillery, 130 men with 6 guns of N Battery 5th Brigade under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Harness. The encampment grew quickly, tents springing up and more troops and supplies arriving. It became an uncomfortable place, and the troops were more than happy when they finally moved the column down to the border post at Rorke's Drift. This spot is named after the trader James Rorke, who had built his house there on the Buffalo River. When you visit the spot now, it's quiet, peaceful, and feels like the middle of nowhere. But that January in 1879 saw the tranquil location overran with more than 4,000 men, 300 wagons, and 1,500 oxen. The army were now impatient and ready for the campaign to begin. At 2 a.m. on the morning of the 11th of January 1879, Reveille was sounded. It was time. The ultimatum given to King Cetshwayo had now passed, and the invasion was about to begin. The guns of N Battery were sighted with a view across the river, though the early morning fog made it difficult to see much beyond the pea-green waters of the Buffalo. Hamilton Brown and his native troops of the NNC were the first to cross into Zululand. Well before daylight in the bitter fog we came down to the drift. The river was full, rapid and very cold, and looked far from tempting. However, orders must be obeyed, so we hardened our hearts and dashed at it, the natives all locking arms and rushing in en masse. My horse was nearly carried off his feet, but having been used to crossing bad rivers in New Zealand, I kept him, and over we got. I do not know how many of my natives were lost. I think that last comment is a pretty bad reflection on his leadership, to be fair, but let's carry on. Now we were in Zululand, cold, wet through and shivering, with our tempers short and crisp. The colonial can grumble just as well as an old Tommy, and he has, as a rule, more command of language. However, it did not take me long to get my men into line, and we pushed on up the rise and took possession of the top of the ridge which we lined. Lieutenant Neville Coghill of the 24th Regiment describes his crossing in his diary that was found after the Battle of Isandlwana. It was a raw, misty morning, the mist rising every now and then and disclosing the position of our forces as they pushed across. But there was no sign of an enemy whom we had been confidently assured by the best authorities on such matters would certainly oppose our crossing. 2 ponts were kept constantly at work for the transport of European troops and supply wagons. The natives crossed at the drift. The latter were a curious sight, these people amusing to look at any time, now with their shields, sticks, blankets, feathers, and other paraphernalia, entering the cold water, which must have reached as far as their waists. This was done without the shouting that usually accompanies them when moving, but with a kind of low whistle, as they felt the cold water rising up their naked bodies as they advanced further into the stream. The camp pitched, all the necessary precautions, we lay down for the night after a long, though satisfying day. The invasion was now well and truly under way, but for now there was still no sign of the Zulu army, and the men of the centre column concentrated on erecting a new camp and ferrying supplies across the river. So where was the famous Zulu impi? And while the British procrastinated on the border, what were Hitswayo's crack troops doing? As you know, tension with the British had been mounting for some time, ever since the sons of a border chief called Sihayo had crossed into Natal to capture and kill 2 of their father's runaway wives, in plain view of Rorke's Drift. The ultimatum that the Zulus had later received from the British, and that we discussed in episode 1, had been a shock. The extent of Frere's demands were clearly aimed at either forcing them to destroy their way of life or to provoke them into a conflict. A proud nation like the Zulus would never willingly castrate themselves to appease a foreign power. The Amabutu or regiments of the Zulu army had been on high alert for some months now, and the troops, who were only part-time and still needed to run their homesteads, were becoming annoyed. There had also been a drought that year, and many of them were going hungry. In fact, as an aside, one of the reasons Lord Chelmsford had deliberately chosen to invade in January was because he figured that the Zulu army would be needed to bring in the harvest, and so would be forced to field a smaller combat force for operations against the British. In January, though, it had become clear that the British invasion was imminent, and the regiments were finally mustered for their pre-war spiritual ceremonies. These ceremonies were a big part of Zulu military life. I recently read a book called Heist, which is all about cash-in-transit heists in South Africa, and it pointed out that even today Zulu criminals will also perform similar types of rituals before going out and conducting their crimes. Some believe that the muti, as it's called, they are given will bring them good luck or make them immune to bullets. The purpose of such rituals is also to cast out impurity and to bind the warriors together. In 1879, each of the regiments would take it in turn to drink medicine they'd be given and then be sick into a hole. There's a description of the ceremony in Ian Knight's excellent book, The Anatomy of the Zulu Army, from a warrior called Mpatsana. He says, "After taking a mouthful or 2 of the medicine in great pots and woven baskets nearby, the warrior proceeds to vomit. Of course, prior to having had any food that day. There may be 3 or 4 pots. 2, 3 or 4 may go up to this hole at any one time. There is naturally a desire to quickly finish and have done with the vomiting, but the doctors will not allow crowding. 2 of them stand on either side of the hole and see that everyone conforms to his instructions. Here and there, the stick may be used on men who have merely pretended to drink the medicated water, and therefore are unable to vomit into the hole as required. And so the vomiting goes on practically all day. I'm not an expert on the Zulu way of life, and so I won't comment too much on these ceremonies. But if you're interested, then I do highly recommend Ian's book mentioned above. By the way, on that point, there will be show notes on my website. If you go to www.redcoathistory.com, you'll find a bibliography with Amazon links to all of the books that I've used in my research. Anyway, back to our story. With the pre-war ceremonies now complete, the army was ready to deploy. Cetshwayo had spies and informers all along the border and into Natal. He knew the disposition of the British forces. He therefore directed those regiments that lived close to the position of the coastal and northern columns to stay and fight in their own areas, while his principal force was to attack what he rightly perceived was the biggest threat to him, Chelmsford's central column. Cetshwayo's instructions to his men were simple and concise. Advance slowly so as not to get exhausted. Don't attack defended positions. Drive the invaders back across the border, but don't cross the border into Natal yourselves. He didn't follow his troops into the field, but instead handed over command to Chief Nsingwayo Kamahole, his most senior advisor. We will return to the movements of the Zulu impi shortly, but for now let us get back to the British camp and their first engagement of the war, the gunfight at Cetshwayo's kraal. It was thought that this operation against the local troublemaker Cetshwayo, whose sons had helped to stir up the British sense of justice, would serve 2 purposes. Firstly, it would be a lesson to Cetshwayo and other Zulu chiefs not to disrespect the British. And also on a more practical military level, it would help to secure Chelmsford's left flank. It's worth pointing out that there has been some historiographical debate as to the exact location of this kraal, but I think that sort of minute detail is probably beyond the scope of this podcast. Hamilton Brown describes the action. It seemed that I'd hardly been to sleep when the faithful Quinn roused me up with a pannikin of coffee, and it was a case of turn out and get my men together. We had some trouble in turning out the natives, but it was done at last and we marched off, being ordered to take post in the rear of the mounted advanced guard. The sun rising as we crossed the ridge and advanced on the precipitous krantz where Cetshwayo had his stronghold. As we got nearer, we could hear the lowing of cattle, the sound coming from a deep cleft running into the precipice. Just then, the screen of mounted men moved away to the right and left, and I received orders to advance to the front. The mounted men cleared my front and I pressed on, passing Lord Chelmsford and his staff, who up to that time had accompanied the advanced guard. The general returned my salute and said, "Brown, those kranzes are full of cattle, go down and take them, but on no account are you to fire before being fired at." He also said, "I shall hold you responsible that no women or children are killed." He then wished me luck in his most kind and courteous manner, a manner that endeared him to all of us. No general that I ever served under in South Africa was so respected and liked as he was, and certainly no colonial officer ever said a word against him or blamed him for the awful disaster that came later on. The krantz was a precipitous mountain about 500 feet high, and where the enemy and the cattle were located was in a deep cleft running in a V-shape, the foot of the hill being covered with boulders and bushes. My men advanced, leaping and jumping, singing war songs, sharpening their assegais, and looking so bloodthirsty that I feared they would kill every woman and child we came across. But as we drew nearer the scene of the action, their zeal for fighting oozed out of them. Their war songs dwindled away, and they seemed indisposed to come on. In fact, some of them, suddenly remembering they had important business to transact towards the rear, had to be encouraged with the butt of the rifle or the ready boot of my non-coms. Myself and all the other officers were in front. This being the case, and we being far more in funk of our playful savages, armed with Martini Henry rifles, than of the enemy, I gave the orders that there was to be no firing, but that we must trust to the steel. By the way, apologies for my rubbish accents and the fact that they kind of change as the story goes on. It's purely to differentiate when I'm giving quotes and when I'm speaking in my own voice, like now. So I hope you can bear with me with that. Lieutenant Coghill picks up the story. It's worth noticing that krantz is a South African term used to describe a cliff face, in case you were wondering. The first volley delivered by the enemy had the effect of wounding several of the NNC who were rather in advance and producing a momentary check. But the first 24th came up, they followed them, and the krantz was taken, and the Zulus expelled from their caves with a loss which is difficult to estimate, but somewhere between 12 and 15 killed. And in the meantime the mounted men had moved round to the flat ground above the krantz, and there met 40 or 50 of the enemy. A sharp exchange of fire took place, resulting in the rout of the Zulus, leaving 18 dead bodies on the ground. After this short, sharp engagement, Chelmsford ordered the homestead to be burnt and all the cattle to be taken. The general was rather self-satisfied with the result of this very small action and wrote to Sir Bartle Frere, "I am in great hopes that the storming of Sihio's stronghold and the capture of many of his cattle, about 500, may have a salutary effect in Zululand and either bring down a large force to attack or produce a revolution in the country. Sihio's men, I am told, have always been looked upon as the bravest in the country, and certainly those who were killed today fought with great courage." But the fact is actually that Sihio and the bulk of his men weren't even around. They were with the main Zulu impi. Even the small force that had been left to defend the kraal managed to put up a stiff fight. But instead of ringing alarm bells in the British camp, this engagement just served to increase their sense of complacency. A sense that this war would be a simple matter of mopping up a brave but outgunned enemy who were unlikely to offer any serious threat. This mood of optimism is reflected in a letter home from Private Owen Ellis. "The war will be over in 2 months' time," he said, "and then we shall be hurrying towards England. We're about to capture all of the cattle belonging to Zulus and also burn their kraals, and if they dare to face us with the intention of fighting, then woe be to them." The advance now continued, but it was hard going and slow due to the ground being both rocky and marshy, and the wagon track they were following needing constant repair and maintenance. On Monday the 20th of January, the column reached its new campsite, the hill of Isandlwana, a rocky feature about 120 metres high. A literal translation of the name Isandlwana is, "It looks just like a little hut," and I'm told is a reference to the second stomach of a cow. Don't ask me, I don't quite get that one. It's a dark and mysterious looking hill that I've been lucky enough to visit a number of times. From different angles it looks like different things, but to many of the British troops that day it became known as the Little Sphinx because of its resemblance to the brass sphinx the men of the 24th wore on their tunic collars. So I just want to take a minute to try my best and explain the geography of the site, which isn't easy. If you are a visual person like me, then do visit www.redcoathistory.com for maps and drawings. But in the meantime, I'll try my best to describe it here. On the north side of Isandlwana is a spur that leads up to a steep slope that I'll refer to as the escarpment. This is quite a steep rocky slope that travels due east away from the camp, almost like a sort of cliff face going directly due east from the north end of the camp. At the top, this becomes what's known as the Inyoni Heights. On the south side of the mountain, a neck joins it to a small hill or kopje, which later became known as Black's Kopje. Between these two features was the wagon park, which is now the visitors' car park if you ever get the chance to visit. The road from Rorke's Drift came around the south side between the mountain and Black's Kopje. That's the opposite side to where the modern road is. Both of these spots will play a major role in our story. To the east of the camp was open ground broken up by dongas, which are dry gullies formed by running water. There was another hill known as the Conical Kopje, which is also to the east and about 1.5 miles in front of the camp. Philip Gonne, in his brilliant book The Road to Isandlwana, describes the layout of the camp. The ground at the foot of Isandlwana was hard and stony, and the camp line had to be drawn about 100 yards in front of its eastern slope, where the soil was more yielding. Column headquarters was established at a point midway along the hill, and the area in front of it was allocated to the 2nd Battalion 24th. On the left of the 2nd Battalion, extending in a line towards the nearby low plateau, Major Cleary placed the 2 battalions of the 3rd NNC. The artillery and the mounted contingent were allocated a place to the right of the 2nd Battalion. The neck was left clear, and the 1st Battalion 24th was sighted on the right flank in front of Black's Copy. The line of the camp stretched for about 1,000 yards, or about 915 metres, just under a kilometre. Some have criticised Chelmsford for choosing this site, but in fairness it does have good fields of fire, especially to the east. There was also enough space for the wagon park, and there was plenty of wood for cooking fires, so there were a number of plus points. On the other hand, it is overlooked by hills to the north, but it was assumed that cavalry vedettes would nullify this potential weakness and give plenty of warning of an enemy approach. It's now we can discuss one of the biggest controversies of the battle and one of the biggest marks on the copybook of Chelmsford. Charles Norris Newman was a journalist, a so-called special correspondent for the London Standard and the Cape Standard. He had embedded himself with the NNC, and when he arrived at the camp he was immediately concerned. "Not a single step was taken in any way to defend our new position in case of a night or day attack from the enemy, either by forming the wagons into a laager or by erecting a shelter trench around it. And it is to this error of judgment that I cannot help attributing the awful results which awaited us." He goes on to say, "We were proceeding with too much confidence and with greater celerity that was consistent with safety. I had throughout always asserted that it would take a longer time than people expected to get to Hetwayo's kraal, much less conquer the country, and also that the mere fact of finding all the younger Zulus retreating in front of us and proceeding to join Hetwayo boded a heavy attack upon one column and should have put us on our guard." Hamilton Brown echoed these thoughts. "I had just reached the camp when Major Cleary, Colonel Glyn's staff officer, rode up and directed me to move to my left, so as to be ready to encamp. He riding with me and pointing out the ground on which my camp was to be pitched, which would be on the extreme left of the line. The column came up and the camp was arranged in the same form as it had been on the bank of the river, only it was much more extended. As soon as the tents were pitched and we had some food, I was joined by Commandant Lonsdale, who had that day come out of hospital. I was talking to some of my best officers when he joined us, and his first words to me were, 'What do you think of this camp?' I replied, 'Someone is mad.' The other colonial officers were loud and long in complaint, and Buncombe said, 'Do the staff think we are here to meet an army of schoolgirls? Why in the name of all that is holy do we not laager?' Now technically Colonel Glyn should have been in charge of the camp's defensive planning, but with Chelmsford accompanying the column and not a man who seemed to like delegating decisions, it was he and not Glyn who would have had the final say on any arrangements. It was sensible and encouraged when campaigning in South Africa to laager your wagons. That means to join them together in a simple but effective defensive position. Lord Chelmsford himself, in the Regulations for Field Forces in South Africa, had stated as much, and suggested that camps should also be partially entrenched on all sides. But this clearly wasn't done. Now look, I know hindsight is always 20/20, but the British didn't have enough wagons to completely laager the camp, and digging trenches in the rocky soil would have been laborious, back-breaking work. Sangers or breastworks of rock or wood could have been built, but it would have taken too long, and Chelmsford hoped to keep moving as soon as possible. At this point in the war, there was no reason to suppose that a force of British Imperial infantry, backed up by artillery and cavalry, were in any way vulnerable to an indigenous enemy armed with spears and cowhide shields. That is, of course, unless you split your forces. The next morning, Chelmsford ordered a force consisting of his NNC infantry under Commandant Lonsdale to patrol south past Malakata to the Mangani Valley and follow the river eastwards. Meanwhile, a mounted detachment under Major Dartnell was to take a different route between the Hlazakazi and the Magogo Hills. Again, I'll post a map of this in the show notes on my website, because frankly the geography and all of these names can become a little confusing. At 4:30 in the morning on the 21st, the NNC set out. They quickly captured hundreds of cattle, and every Zulu they met was questioned. A young girl told them that a large Zulu impi was massing to the northeast. Later, 2 young men were tortured for information. As Hamilton Brown says, "They were led apart and well questioned. War is war, and you can't play at savage war with kid gloves on. The information amounted to this. They had both left the big army and had come over to see their mother. We inquired, 'Where is the big army?' and they pointed in the same direction that the girl had done. When was the attack to take place, they did not know, but the moon would be right in 2 days' time, they said." This last reference is to do with the coming of the new moon, which is a bad omen to the Zulus. It was a difficult day, hot as hell, and the men had covered great distances across rocky ground. As evening approached, 2 mounted men rode into the NNC position and requested that they join with Major Dartnell and his mounted troops in engaging a party of Zulus they had discovered. Hamilton Brown and the others advised against it, as the men were tired and it would soon be dark, but Lonsdale was keen for a fight and agreed. Our intrepid journalist Charles Norris Newman takes up the story. "News that we had still to go on a few miles was not well received, but after much grumbling, for the men were tired and hungry, we marched across the top to the other northeastern ridge and could then see on the next range, 3 miles off, a large body of Zulus, about 2,000 strong, who were massing and seemed inclined to come down to attack the cavalry, which had descended across the valley and were halted about a mile from them. We waited very patiently, and then saw a small body of volunteers detached and gallop up to within 800 yards of the Zulus, when instantly, and with beautiful precision, 2 companies of the enemy opened out into skirmishing order and tried to surround the party, although they did not fire a single shot. Our men, following their instructions, had seen enough, wheeled around and joined the main body again. The Zulus did not follow far." Night falls quickly in South Africa. Sunset is over in a flash. Hamilton Brown explains the situation. "Here we were, at least 11 miles from camp. No food, no spare ammunition, well knowing that a huge army of Zulus must be in our close vicinity. Well, I was not in command, but I begged Lonsdale even at that hour to return to camp. I said, 'We know the camp is going to be attacked. Every cock fights best in his own backyard. When the general hears our news, he will order the camp to be laagered and we can put up a fight there against the whole Zulu nation. Whilst out here we shall be stamped flat in a minute.' But no, Lonsdale would not grasp the situation and decided to stay where we were with the intention of going for those few Zulus in the morning." Meanwhile, as the sun was setting over Isandlwana, 2 staff officers who had been with Major Dartnell rode back into the camp with the news of their engagement. They told the general that Dartnell and the NNC intended to bivouac by the Mangeni River, 12 miles from camp, and then attack the Zulus in the morning. In the middle of the night, another messenger arrived from Dartnell with further information about the size of the Zulu force. Chelmsford was now uncertain. Could Dartnell have stumbled upon the main Zulu impi? Should he call them back and laager the camp in preparation for an attack, or should he take the fight to the enemy by marching to Dartnell's assistance and advancing to contact? In the end, he decided to split his forces. His largest infantry battalion, the 2nd 24th, would accompany him, less Lieutenant Pope's G Company, which was due to supply the camp's sentries that day. The camp came to life as the men quickly gathered 70 rounds each of ammunition and a day's supply of rations. Back at the Mangeni, it had been a hairy night for the men of the NNC. A false alarm had seen the pickets open fire at ghosts. Norris Newman explains what happened. "I was trying to sleep at the centre of the square near the commandant. At the time we were both dozing off when the first thing I remember was being trod upon by horses. Then a shout arose and several dusky forms, naked and brandishing weapons, ran over me. Imagining the Zulus were coming, I got up with my rifle and clubbed one man down and then went to try and find my horse." Shortly afterwards, he spotted that the men he perceived as the enemy were wearing red cloths around their heads and were in fact men of the NNC. Eventually the square was reformed, but he had had enough and went to sleep amongst the men of the mounted police, where he felt much safer. It was with great relief for the men so far away from camp when the night sky began to lighten. Out of the thick fog came some horsemen from Isandlwana, bringing blankets and some provisions. Just after dawn on the 22nd of January, Chelmsford himself arrived with his troops, but to his dismay the large Zulu force was nowhere to be seen. He sent the NNC and the men of the 24th to sweep the hills and discover where they'd gone. Back at Isandlwana under the mountain, the men who had been left behind set about their daily chores, grumbling about missing out on the action. They were relaxed, and there was no sense that the camp was in danger. After all, there were still over 1,000 of them, heavily armed and well drilled. There was no way they could be surprised and defeated. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Pullein of the 1st 24th was left in charge of the camp. He'd been in the army a long time, but his skills were more administration and logistics rather than combat. As the rest of the column had departed, he had been told to draw in his infantry pickets, but to keep his cavalry vedettes far out to look for any potential danger. Now, as we get into the story of the battle, it's worth mentioning an important note, and that's the unreliability of timings. Especially when reading the primary sources, watches of the era could be unreliable, and every town and city in the world had a different time, set locally, depending on when the sun reached its zenith. Remember, this was before the world was officially divided into time zones, so it was quite complicated. These discrepancies in timings make it a little difficult to pinpoint exactly how the battle played out, but I'll do my best. At around 7:30 a.m, as the men were lining up for their breakfast, there was the distinct sound of gunfire. The column's transport officer, Captain Edward Essex, tells us what happened next. A report arrived from a picket stationed on a point about 1,500 yards distant, on a hill to the north of the camp, that a body of the enemy's troops could be seen approaching from the northeast. Lieutenant Colonel Pullein thereupon caused the whole of the troops available to assemble near the eastern side of the camp, facing towards the reported direction of the enemy's approach. Shortly after 9 a.m, a small body of the enemy showed itself just over the crest of the hills in the direction they were expected, but retired a few minutes afterwards and dispersed. Soon afterwards, information arrived from a picket that the enemy was in 3 columns, 2 of which were retiring but still in view. The third had disappeared in a northwesterly direction. After some time, Pullein was still none the wiser as to the size of the force or its destination. Where was it going? He thought maybe he'd overreacted. After all, presumably the Zulus would be like the Xhosa, hard to draw into a serious battle. Meanwhile, at around 10 a.m, Lieutenant Colonel Durnford arrived from Rorke's Drift with his force of 250 native horsemen, followed by a company of the NNC and Major Russell's rocket battery. You may remember Durnford from episode 1. He's the Royal Engineer officer who had a rare respect for his black troops and made sure his native horsemen were well armed and well trained. He also had an independent spirit that troubled his superiors. Chelmsford had sent orders to Durnford during the night as he wanted to keep him close where he could be more easily controlled. Technically, Durnford was now the senior officer in the camp. He was a full colonel, whereas Pullein was a brevet lieutenant colonel. But this is where there was some confusion, because despite being the senior man, Durnford did not have any specific orders, whereas Pullein had been told to defend the camp. This was his only priority. Durnford's transport officer, Captain Cochrane, explained the conversation that followed. Colonel Pullein gave over to Colonel Durnford a verbal state of the troops in camp at the time, and stated the order he had received, viz. To defend the camp. These words were repeated 2 or 3 times during the conversation. Several messages were delivered, the last one to the effect that the Zulus were retiring in all directions. Colonel Durnford sent 2 troops of mounted natives to the top of the hills to the left, and took with him 2 troops and the rocket battery, with an escort of 1 company of the NNC to the front of the camp, about 4 or 5 miles off. Before leaving, he asked Colonel Pullein to give him 2 companies of the 24th Regiment. Colonel Pullein said that with the orders he had received he could not do it, but agreed with Colonel Durnford to send him help if he got into difficulties. At around 11:45 a.m, it was the men of Durnford's Zikali horse, sent to the plateau to the northeast of the camp, who soon made a terrifying and startling discovery. Lieutenant Charles Raw was with them. We left the camp proceeding over the hills. the enemy in small clumps retiring before us for some time, drawing us 4 or 5 miles from the camp, where they turned and fell upon us, the whole army showing itself from behind the hill in front, where they had evidently been waiting. An even more dramatic account comes from James Hamer, a civilian who accompanied the patrol. After going some little way, we tried to capture some cattle. They disappeared over a ridge, and on coming up we saw the Zulus like ants in front of us and in perfect order, as quiet as mice, and stretched across in an even line. He estimated at the time that there was about 12,000 of them. In fact, there was over 20,000. Imagine the horror of that moment. What a sight it must have been, the Zulu army in all its glory. The Zulu force that day was commanded by Nsingwayo Kamahole, supported by Mavumengwana Kaundlela. Apologies for any Zulus listening for my butchering of those names, but you get the idea. It's said that they didn't wish to attack the British camp that day because of the new moon that we mentioned earlier. They hadn't even done their usual pre-battle rituals at this point. But the Zulu leaders would have been well aware that Chelmsford had split his force and that the camp was at its weakest. Any doubt about when to launch their assault went out of the window when the Zikali horse spotted them. The impi deployed into its classic horns of the bull shape, with a thick chest of men in the centre, as well as a right and left horn, whose job was to flank the enemy and encircle them. There was also the loins or the reserve. The composition of each element at Isandlwana is often debated, and the sources are somewhat hazy, but I'll try and give a brief overview based on the research of historian Keith Smith. The right horn was probably around 2,500 men and consisted of the Nonkenke, Isangu, Dududu and Mbube regiments. The centre or chest numbered around 9,000 men and included elements of the Ngobamakosi regiment as well as the Mhapo and Mhijo regiments. The left horn, which was the one about to engage Durnford's men and sweep across the plain from the east, was nearly 6,000 men strong. It included other elements of the Ngobamakosi, as well as elements of the Undikor and the Uve regiment. The reserve, which we will meet again at Rorke's Drift in next month's episode, consisted of 4,000 men and included the Tulwana, Indlondlo and Dloko regiments. Okay, back to the story. Lieutenant Kavai's company of the 1st Battalion 24th, currently on the plateau north of the camp, were spread out in line when their calm was interrupted by the sound of rifle fire and the appearance of the native horse retiring in front of them in extended order. The news of the discovery of the Zulu impi was quickly passed on to Pulaine by Captain Shepston, who stumbled into the command tent, dusty and out of breath. "I'm not an alarmist, sir, but the Zulus are in such black masses over there that you have to give as much assistance as you can. They're fast driving our men this way." At the same time, Pulaine had also received orders from Chelmsford to strike the camp and to move to the Mangani River. He sent a message back that he couldn't currently do so due to the heavy firing to the left of camp. As senior officer with no previous experience, Pulaine was in a very tricky situation. At this point, if he had pulled in all of his troops to a tight defensive formation, they may have had a chance. But that is hindsight speaking. After all, the level of danger still wasn't clear, and he was torn between his need to help Durnford, who was off charging around the countryside, striking the camp as he'd been ordered, and calling back his units. At this point, he was probably remembering the last frontier war with the Xhosa, and the ease with which native attacks were generally repulsed. It's likely that he still hadn't grasped the very real danger that he and the camp was in. From where he was at the foot of Isandlwana, Pulaine couldn't see much of the Zulu deployments to the north and west, so he had very little information to go on. He was in a really tricky situation, actually. What he did next was to send Captain Mostyn's F Company across the spur to the north of the camp to support Kavai's men, who were now engaged with the advanced elements of the Zulu force, who were moving west across their front, apparently unperturbed by the rifle fire directed against them. A young transport officer watched the Zulus begin to deploy. Smith Dorian, who later went on to command a corps in World War I, was impressed. "It was a marvellous sight," he said. line upon line of men in slightly extended order, one behind the other, firing as they came along, bearing all before them. Meanwhile, Durnford, who had been following along the foot of the escarpment that led up to the plateau to the northeast of the camp, was in trouble. He was about 5 miles away from the camp and not aware of the scale of the Zulu threat, when he almost literally ran into the left horn of the Zulu impi. He quickly ordered his men to dismount and fire a volley at the enemy, before they began to withdraw back towards the camp, firing volleys at the advancing foe at every opportunity. His rocket battery, though, under Major Russell, was in big trouble. They were further back behind him, and as they wheeled around to move up the escarpment and engage a force of Zulus, they came under heavy attack. There was a captain of the NNC who were escorting the 3 9-pounders. His name was Norse, Captain Norse, and he recalls, "Before reaching the crest of the hills on the left of camp, one rocket was sent off, and the enemy was on us. The first volley dispersed the mules and the natives." Rockets were a new weapon to the Zulus, and when the battery fired one with its banshee scream, it had a terrifying but just a temporary effect. As Ian Knight says, "The Hales pattern rockets were simple cylindrical shells with no fins or sticks to stabilize them in flight. They were filled with a rapid burning propellant, which burned unpredictably but with great rush of sparks and smoke." A number of the attacking Zulus had rifles and knew how to use them, and they sprang up from the long grass and returned fire, causing casualties amongst the British, including Major Russell, who was one of the first to be killed. At this point, many of the men of the locally recruited NNC turned tail, leaving their officers and the gunners alone and unsupported. Captain Norse helped to rally the men and keep the Zulus at bay, long enough for some of the other survivors to escape. The Zulus facing him, though, were only skirmishers and didn't really press their attack too hard, allowing him and his men to join up with Durnford and withdraw. It was now around 12:30 in the afternoon, and the battle, like the day, was rapidly getting hotter. By now, Mostyn and Kavai's companies of the 1st 24th on the ridge were in danger of being outflanked. It was hot work. They were taking incoming, albeit slightly inaccurate, rifle fire. They must have felt very isolated, and I suspect at least some of them were beginning to fear that this battle may not end like those of the Frontier War had. They were now ordered back down along the spur toward the camp. I think this is a good time to take a look at the dispositions of the British force as the battle begins to really reach its zenith. Again, I recommend you look at the maps over at my Redcoat History website, www.redcoathistory.com, but I'll try my best to explain. The companies of the 1st 24th were now formed into a rough and slightly disjointed line on the north side of the camp, facing towards the Inyoni Heights. On the spur between the plateau and Isandlwana Hill were the companies of Younghusband, Mostyn and Kavai. To their right were elements of the Zikali Horse and some NNC, followed by the 2 guns of the Royal Artillery. Then was Wardell's H Company, and on the extreme right of the line was Pope's Company of the 2nd Battalion, which had been left behind when the rest of their battalion had moved off with Lord Chelmsford. It was a big company, as it included all of the men of the 2nd Battalion who for one reason or another had been left behind. Their position seemed very precarious as the flank was wide open with no obvious place for it to be anchored. I'd like to mention briefly at this stage as well how the British infantry would have deployed. By the 1870s they were moving away from the Napoleonic shoulder-to-shoulder 2-man deep lines that had torn up Napoleon's elite columns. The officers' experiences in the recent Frontier War had also made it clear that the rough terrain of South Africa made this type of tight formation difficult, and so they would have extended the infantry in a wider line. A 76-centimetre gap between each rifleman was recommended, but before the war Chelmsford had advised double this. We'll never know for certain, but it's likely that at Isandlwana there was approximately a metre and a half between each man, with the officers at the back directing the fire. As Ian Knight points out in his brilliant book Zulu Rising, that means that each company would have had a frontage of over 120 metres, a thin, potentially very fragile red line. To the southeast were Durnford's Basutu horsemen, who had now taken up position in a donga, which is a dry water course, a few hundred metres due east of the camp. They had dismounted and were keeping the left horn at bay with disciplined, steady fire. But the British position was now very extended. Unbeknown to most of the men in the firing line, the right horn of the Zulu impi had already swung around to the west of Isandlwana and cut off the line of retreat back to Rorke's Drift. For now, though, there was a bit of a pause. The Zulus seemed to catch their breath. They kept their distance, and those with firearms used them to pick holes in the redcoat ranks below them. But the pause didn't last for long, and soon they were streaming forward and working their way down from cover to cover. The heights were now thick with Zulus, making an immense noise with their war cry of Usutu. Pulaine could see that there was a worrying gap between the men facing north towards the escarpment and Durnford's men to their right. He put all of his mounted men in the camp, over 100, under the command of Captain Bradstreet of the Newcastle Mounted Rifles, and sent them to take up a position that could support Durnford. At this point also, Pulaine should have struck the tents of the camp, pulling them flat so that they couldn't be an obstruction if his line needed to withdraw. But he either didn't think it would come to that, or perhaps he simply forgot. The battle was developing quickly, and his mind may have been focused at the thick swarm of Zulus coming down the escarpment and across the plain. Between the heavy fire of Durnford's and Bradstreet's dismounted horsemen, the left horn was blunted and forced to find whatever cover they could. Slowly they began to extend further to their left to outflank the defenders. As one Zulu warrior recalled, "They'd drawn their horses into a donga, and all we could see were their helmets. They fired so heavily that we had to retire. We kept lying down and rising again. Then, when the firing became very heavy, we retired towards the left wing." I've stood inside the donga where Durnford's men were. I'll post that video, by the way, in the show notes for this on my website. It's essentially a jagged, dry stream bed like a broad, uneven trench that offers decent cover and would have allowed his men to lay down a heavy volume of fire from comparative safety, really. Talking of volume of fire, how quickly could trained British troops fire their Martini Henrys, and how reliable were they? Well, Philip Gon, in his book The Road to Isandlwana, says, "The fastest aimed rate of fire under ideal conditions with the Martini Henry rifle was 12 rounds per minute. But the thin rolled brass cartridges were far from perfect. The expended cases frequently stuck in the overheated chambers and sometimes required prizing out with knives. Even greater delays occurred when the ejection claw ripped off the end plate. Also, officers liked to control their men with volley fire, and I think 12 rounds a minute sounds unrealistic for a company formed into line. I suspect from my research that the actual rate of fire was probably less than half of that. There can be few things worse than having a difficult stoppage in the middle of a firefight. I was once caught up in a gunfight in Afghanistan between the Royal Marines and the Taliban, and when I heard the call, "Does anyone have a hard extraction pole?" I knew that even with today's modern rifles, stoppages still occur and are still terrifying. But across the entire line, ammunition was becoming scarce. It had never occurred to the commanders that 70 rounds of ammunition per man just would not be enough. Smith Dorrien recalled that the Zulus had been on the verge of pulling back when they noticed that the rate of fire slackened and took fresh heart. He took it upon himself to try and organise a resupply to the men at the front. "When I saw the whole Zulu army advancing, I collected up camp stragglers such as artillerymen in charge of spare horses, officers' servants, etc., and had taken them to the ammunition boxes where we broke them open as fast as we could. We kept sending the packets to the firing line. In those days the boxes were screwed down and it was a very difficult job to get them open, and it was owing to this battle that the construction of the boxes were changed. When I had engaged at this for some time and the 1st 24th had fallen back to where we were with the Zulus following closely, Bloomfield, the quartermaster of the 2nd 24th, said to me in regard to the boxes I was then breaking open, clunky writing, 'For heaven's sake, don't take that, man, as it belongs to our battalion.' And I replied, 'Hang it all, you don't want a requisition form now, do you?' And as the ammunition was distributed, it began to reap a heavy toll on the attacking Zulus. Let's think about it from their perspective for a moment. These were tough warriors, sure, but they'd never before been faced by well-trained, well-led regular infantry pouring volley after volley of heavy caliber bullets into them. The Martini Henry round will shatter whatever it hits.
Half a century later, Nkosi Zimema recalled that some of our men had their arms torn right off. The battle was so fierce that we had to wipe the blood and the brains of the killed and wounded from our heads, faces, arms, legs and shields after the fighting. And of course, it wasn't just bullets they were facing. Major Smith commanded 2 7-pounders, which were also firing steadily throughout the battle, showering the Zulus with shrapnel shells that, when they burst accurately above the enemy, reaped a terrible harvest. In the heat of the battle, though, the Zulus, who were clearly quick learners, began to understand how these weapons worked, and every time the guns were ready to fire, they would shout, "Umoya," which means the wind, and drop to the floor. We'll look at the final casualties of the battle later, but even at this stage they had lost a lot of men killed and terribly wounded. It says much for the spirit of the Impi that day that they kept attacking in the face of such horror. The key to the battle now seems to be the ability of Durnford and his natives, as well as the irregular cavalry, to hold the Donga, keep the left horn at bay, and stop the infantry who were facing north from being outflanked and attacked from behind. Could they do it? It was a big ask for a small force. They were too far away for the men of Pope's company to offer much support, so they were essentially on their own against the entire left horn. Jabez Molife of the Edendale contingent was with them. He remembers Durnford in the heart of things, doing his best to advise and encourage. He says, "Here we made a long stand, firing incessantly. The colonel rode up and down our line continually, encouraging us all. He was very calm and cheerful, talking and even laughing with us. 'Fire, my boys! Well done, my boys!' he cried. Some of us did not like his exposing himself so much to the enemy, and wanted him to keep behind us. But he laughed at us and said, 'All right, nonsense.' There were not very many of us, but because of the way in which we were handled by our leader, we were enough to stop the Zulus on that side for a long time." But the men in the Donga with Durnford had 2 big problems. They were running out of ammo, and their flanks were in danger of being turned. With regards to the ammunition, Ian Knight points out that they had rushed into battle that morning before the arrival of their baggage train, and so when the call went up for more ammunition, nobody knew where to find it. The men sent back to do so hoped that the quartermasters of the 24th would help them. But even in the heat of battle, professional British soldiers follow regulations and refused to give their precious ammunition to men from another unit, especially blacks who they didn't know. Only a direct order from a senior officer in his own regiment would have made the quartermaster relent, and that wasn't forthcoming. Small groups of Zulus now began pushing through the gaps between Pope's company from the 2nd Battalion and Durnford's men. Soon a number of them had infiltrated into the camp itself. Chaos now began to engulf the battlefield. In the Donga, the realisation that they had been outflanked caused Durnford to order the men to fall back. According to Trooper Edwards, men began to realise the hopeless position in which we had landed. Suddenly one of them shouted hoarsely, "The Zulus are in the camp!" And they were, with a vengeance. Then came the order, whipped out grimly, "Stand to your horses, retire to camp." We all dashed for our horses, but mine had disappeared. I looked round with growing despair, and a quiet voice behind me said, "Here's a horse, is it yours?" Colonel Durnford was holding it and walking close behind me. Without more ado, we went back to the camp. The end of the battle was now in sight. Durnford's withdrawal left Pope's company with its arse in the air, and the officers in the camp, such as Captain Essex, were very worried by developments. He approached Durnford as he came into the camp, who immediately requested some men to help defend the rear. Essex didn't have men, he couldn't help, there was no reserves. So let's step back for a moment. As the battle rages and the men in the camp find themselves in serious danger, what was happening to the rest of the column? Where were they, and was Lord Chelmsford aware of the disaster that was unfolding under the shadow of the mountain? Our old friend Hamilton Brown, who was with the column, had been given orders to head back towards the camp and help Pulaine to strike the camp and join up with the rest of the column. As he and his men pushed through the heat, they made a shocking discovery. He says, "At about 11 o'clock I was on ahead and looking through my glasses when I saw a puff of smoke rise from the hills on the left of camp. It was followed by another. They seemed to come from a huge black shadow that lay on the hills. Presently another puff, and in a moment I knew they were bursting shells. Not a cloud was in the sky, and I knew that the black shadow resting on the hills must be the Zulu army moving down to attack the camp. He sent a note back to Chelmsford with his discovery, but he was informed to keep going. It seems as a colonial officer at the head of black levies, his reports weren't given the urgency they deserved. Charles Norris Newman, still embedded with the column, reports that the day seemed calm until just after noon when it was at first uneasy suspicions around in our minds that some important, possibly sinister events were perhaps in progress at the camp. Mr. Longcast, the general's interpreter, learned from one of the prisoners that an immense army had been expected to arrive that day. Suddenly, during his cross-examination of other prisoners, the sound of artillery fire was distinctly heard in the direction of the camp, and the Zulus immediately said, "Do you hear that? There was fighting going on at the camp." Lord Chelmsford was informed, and Norris Newman continues the story. "He at once galloped up to the crest of the hill accompanied by his staff, and on arrival every field glass was levelled at the camp. The sun was shining brightly on the white tents which were plainly visible, but all seemed quiet. There was no signs of firing or of an engagement that could be seen." But for Hamilton Brown, whose battalion was now close to the battlefield, the reality of the situation soon became blindingly apparent. "I had given orders to my men to deflect to their left so as to try and get into the right of the camp, and the officers and non-coms were forcing the brutes on. When about 1:30 I happened to glance to the right of the camp. Good God, what a sight it was! By the road that runs between the hill and the kopje came a huge mob of maddened cattle, followed by a dense swarm of Zulus. These poured into the undefended right and rear of the camp, and at the same time the left horn of the enemy and the chest of the army rushed in. Nothing could stand against this combined attack. All formation was broken in a minute, and the camp became a seething pandemonium of men and cattle struggling in dense clouds of dust and smoke." The final Zulu charge had been inspired by a chief called Umkasana. Dressed in his best regalia, he strode forward amongst the men who had been taking cover, bullets ricocheting off rocks all around him, and he called on them to remember their duty and the honour of the regiment. His speech had the desired effect, but just as the men rose up with their cry of "Usutu," he was shot in the head and never lived to see the victory that he had now just inspired. There was now no other option for the British firing line facing north but to try and withdraw back to camp. The men of the 24th probably weren't aware of how perilous things had now become, but they would have been exhausted from the long engagement in the hot sun, shoulders were bruised from the constant kick of the Martini Henrys, and the sight of the Zulus pushing forward despite heavy fire must have elicited a grudging respect for a worthy foe. A bugle call sounded the retire, and despite good discipline, gaps began to appear in the line, and the Zulus saw their chance. So here's a thought to ponder. If you were a British soldier that day, perhaps in the camp on other duties, or attached to one of the NNC units, and you saw that the battle was now as good as lost, what would you have done? If you had a horse, now was your chance to make a dash for it. It must have been a tough decision to make, knowing that if you left you would feel a coward for the rest of your life, but that if you stayed, that life would only last for another few minutes. Captain Lonsdale of the NNC made his decision, handed his horse to one of his men and waded into action alongside the Redcoats, never to be seen again. But even for those who decided to make a run for it, safety was a long way off. Smith Dorrien was one of them. He says, "When the final charge took place, the transport, which were inspanned, had mostly cleared the neck, and I jumped on my broken-kneed pony, which had had no rest for 30 hours, and followed it, to find on top in the neck a scene of confusion I will never forget. For some 4,000 Zulus had come in behind and were busy with shield and assegai. Into this mass, revolver in hand, I rode right through the Zulus." The horns of the buffalo had done their job exceptionally well, and as the British tried to withdraw, or in many cases simply run away, they found their path back to Rorke's Drift blocked. One of the Zulu survivors later recalled, "We worked around behind Isandlwana under the cover of the long grass and dongas, intending to join the Ungobamakosi on the neck and sweep in upon the camp. Then we saw the white men beginning to run away along the road to Kwajim." That's Rorke's Drift. "Many of these were cut off and killed, down in the stream which flows through the bottom of the valley. More and more came over, some mounted and some on foot. When they saw that the valley was full of our warriors, they turned to the left and ran along the side of the hill towards the Umzinyati, or the Buffalo, river. Those who had not got horses were soon overtaken. The Nodwengu pursued the mounted men, numbers of whom were killed among the thorns and dongas, but I heard that some escaped. Our regiment went over into the camp. The ground is high and full of dongas and stones, and the soldiers did not see us until we were upon them. Meanwhile, the firing line was still rippling with volleys and trying to withdraw in good order. Seeing they were surrounded, they now formed square, a sensible manoeuvre in these circumstances, and one usually used for receiving cavalry. But as they reached the camp, their formation was hindered by the tents and the general mess scattered about, which created gaps and allowed the Zulus to get in amongst them. It was now a bayonet fight, a vicious bloody battle to the death with no quarter asked or given. The Zulus don't make a habit of taking prisoners. It's hard now to comprehend the confusion or the violence of that moment. Thousands of men stabbing, shooting and clubbing at close range. Any chance of retreat was now over. Trooper Edwards recalled, "We were soon reduced to using the butts of our rifles. Every here and there I could see small groups of men selling their lives dearly, using their fists, rifle butts and daggers to terrible purpose." From a nearby vantage point, Hamilton Brown watched the chaos. "One company in Company Square was retreating slowly up the hill, surrounded by a dense swarm of Zulus. This was Captain Younghusband's company. They kept the enemy off as long as their ammunition lasted, then used the bayonet, until at last, overcome by numbers, they fell in a heap like the brave old British Tommy should." But things now got even stranger, as the skies above this horror suddenly turned dark. A partial, or technically annular, I don't know how you say that word, solar eclipse coinciding with the height of the battle. A Zulu witness said, "The sun turned black in the middle of the battle. We could still see it over us, or should have thought we had been fighting till the evening. Then we got into the camp, and there was a great deal of smoke and firing. Afterwards the sun came out bright again." As Ian Knight said, the event added an apocalyptic touch, entirely in keeping with the dark grandeur of the Isandlwana story. As this was happening, Durnford led the fight around the wagon park with around 60 survivors, mainly police and local volunteers. They put up a stiff fight, but their death was inevitable. For Durnford, survival wasn't really an option. An officer of his rank could never survive a defeat like this and still maintain his honour. The last stand of the men of the 24th seems to have been a group of survivors under Lieutenant Anstey. These 40 or so men fought their way back, firing and stabbing as they went. They got as far as the Manzinyama, which is about a kilometre south of Isandlwana, before being overwhelmed and killed. It says a lot for their cohesion and training as a unit that they managed to get so far across undulating rocky ground while being constantly attacked. There's also an interesting story of a lone survivor, some say the last man to be killed on the battlefield, who it is said climbed up the hill and made his last stand from a small cave that looks out over the south side of the mountain. I've climbed up to that cave, and it's easy to see how a determined man with ammunition and a strong heart could have held out there for some time. But just imagine the emotions he must have been feeling on his own, surrounded, and witnessing the ghastly carnage overwhelming his entire regiment. We don't know exactly what happened to this man, but eventually he too was killed. Throughout the afternoon, the civilian wagon drivers had been leaving the camp and heading for the safety of Natal. They had been closely followed by many of the black levies, and now with the battle in its final gory moments, anybody who could tried to make their escape. Captain Norse, who we last met when the rocket battery was overwhelmed, was one of those still alive. I can't remember what accent I did for him, but I'll just go with my generic officer's accent. "Being alone on foot with an empty revolver, my chances of escape appeared most remote. But just as I was thinking of making for a donga, my native servant rode up, handed me my horse and shot away without being able to question him. Hope had revived, and I now had a loaded revolver. The thought then occurred to me that if I could get into the thousands of animals that were rushing through the neck, bellowing, braying and bleating, with a cloud of dust hanging over them, I might get through. It reminded me forcibly of the biblical description of the defeat of the Babylonians. I joined the maddened beasts and got through. But escape was to be a difficult, exhausting and bloody business. With the road to Rorke's Drift cut, there was a narrow gap between the Zulu horns at the south side of the mountain, leading down towards the Manzimnyama stream. Lieutenant Henry Curling of the Royal Artillery describes the scene. The Zulus were in the middle of the crowd, stabbing the men as they ran. When we had gone about 400 yards, we came to a deep cut in which the guns stuck, and the Zulus were in amongst them all at once, and the drivers pulled off their horses. I've walked the route now known as Fugitives Trail. It's a difficult path across rough terrain and up the steep slopes of Mpete Hill before a very tricky descent down to the Mzinyati or Buffalo River that marked the old border between Zululand and Natal. It's tough going even without the distraction of the enemy chasing you desperate for your blood. When I swam the river it was calm and not particularly broad, but on that summer's day of 1879 it was swollen and the water was rough. I made a film of the day when I walked the trail, which will probably give you a good idea of the terrain. If you go to www.redcoathistory.com, you'll find it in the show notes for this episode, episode 2. Smith Dorian, who managed to fight his way out of the camp, now describes his escape from the river. I then came to Fugitives Drift, the descent to which was almost a precipice. I found there a man in a red coat badly assegaied in the arm, unable to move. I managed to make a tourniquet out of a handkerchief to stop the bleeding and got him halfway down when a shout from behind said, "Get on, man, the Zulus are on top of you." I turned around and saw Major Smith, Royal Artillery, who was commanding the section of guns, as white as a sheet and bleeding profusely, and in a second we were surrounded. Assegais accounted for poor Smith and for my mounted infantry friend and for my horse. With the help of my revolver and a wild jump down the rocks, I found myself in the Buffalo River. But like any good British battle, there was still time for some Victoria Crosses to be won. 3, in fact, although at the time of the battle posthumous VCs were not allowed, and so it wasn't until 1907 that 2 of them were awarded. Those 2 were for Lieutenants Melville and Coghill of the 1st 24th. Tynemouth Melville was the adjutant of the 1st 24th, and as the battle was drawing to its conclusion, he took a horse, found the Queen's colours of the regiment, and left with them, hoping to save them from falling into the enemy's hands, which would have been a disgrace. It's worth noting that, as Ian Knight points out, it's also likely that he had planned to unfurl them and raise them as a rallying point for the men, which would have been its primary role in the battle of this era. But as the speed of the Zulu advance became apparent, he shelved this plan and chose to save them and himself. With them cased and across his saddle, he made a dash for the Buffalo River. While trying to cross, he became separated from his horse, but desperately hanging on to the colours, which are quite an awkward item to carry by the way, he managed to reach a large coffin-shaped rock in the middle of the river, which he clung to for dear life alongside Lieutenant Higginson of the NNC. Meanwhile, Colonel Glynn's orderly, Lieutenant Coghill, who had been left behind in the camp that day due to having a badly twisted knee, saw the predicament of the men and the colours. He had already used his horse to wade across to the Natal bank, but turned around and went back into the water to help the others. The Zulus were now there in great force, firing on the men. Coghill's horse was quickly killed, but he managed to reach Melville and Higginson and help them across to the Natal bank. But the colours were lost in the struggle. The men were probably the last British troops to escape across the river, but sadly the Natal bank didn't bring them safety. In a letter to Coghill's father, Higginson described what happens next. When we had got 100 yards up the bank, we saw 2 Zulus following us, and when they got to within 30 yards of us, Melville and Coghill fired and killed them both. I was without arms of any kind, having lost my rifle in the river, and I didn't have a revolver. When we had gone a few yards further, Melville said he could go no further, and Coghill said the same. I don't think they imagined at this time that anyone was following us. When they stopped, I pushed on, reaching the top of the hill. I found 4 Basutos with whom I escaped by holding a horse's tail. It was probably now about 3:30 in the afternoon. Melville and Coghill were never seen alive again. The spot where the 2 men were eventually killed is a steep climb, and I can only imagine how exhausted they must have been after such a horrific day and the exertions of their escape from the camp. I'm sure we've all experienced that sort of overwhelming tiredness, where you reach a point of no longer caring what happens to you, you just need to rest. There is still a question mark over who killed the men, and it is commonly thought that it was Zulus living in Natal, having been called by their kinsmen from across the river to finish off the white men. A sad irony and end to the day, really. Melville had been close to celebrating his 3rd wedding anniversary and left behind 2 sons. The other VC won that day was also at the river. It was Private Samuel Wassell of the 80th South Staffordshire Regiment. He was a 22-year-old attached to the mounted infantry. His citation says, "For his gallant conduct in having, at the imminent risk of his own life, saved that of Private Westwood of the same regiment. On the 22nd January 1879, when the camp at Isandlwana was taken by the enemy, Private Wassell retreated towards the Buffalo River, in which he saw a comrade struggling and apparently drowning. He rode to the bank, dismounted, leaving his horse on the Zulu side, rescued the man from the stream, and again mounted his horse, dragging the Private Westwood across the river under a heavy shower of bullets." Meanwhile, back at the camp, the victorious Zulus set about plundering and performing their cleansing rituals, which included slitting open the stomachs of their dead enemy to allow their spirits to pass to the afterlife. Many found liquor and became drunk. Other more practical warriors rounded up 1,000 Martini Henry rifles and the camp's entire ammunition supply, which would later be put to good use. But as the afternoon wore on, the Zulus, many of them wounded and all of them exhausted, began to leave the battlefield and climb back up the Inyoni heights to their bivouac of the previous night. The battle was over. Only the dead remained around Isandlwana. As Chelmsford's column made its way back towards the camp they had left that morning, they still believed that the attack must have been repulsed. When Hamilton Brown told the general face to face that the camp was taken, he refused to believe it. The NNC officer says, "He looked very surprised when he saw me and said, 'What are you doing here, Commandant Brown? You ought to have been in the camp hours ago.' I replied, 'The camp has been taken, sir.' He flashed out at once, 'How dare you tell me such a falsehood? Get your men into line at once and advance.' When the truth finally dawned on Lord Chelmsford, he was reported to have said, 'I can't understand it. I left 1,000 men to guard the camp.' When you think about it from his perspective, it must have been almost impossible to comprehend. Imperial British troops were not in the habit of being defeated by lightly armed natives. He had seen the Xhosa in action and assumed that the Zulus would not dare be drawn into a large battle. He was wrong, and his men paid the price. Final casualties at Isandlwana were horrific for both sides. The casualties for the British were 858 whites killed and 471 black troops, wagon drivers and non-combatants, a total of 1,329 dead, an incredibly high proportion of those engaged. It's also worth noting that, as the official history says, this disaster also deprived the centre column of all of its transport and rendered the troops who composed it incapable of making any offensive movement. The invasion now looked in serious danger of collapsing, at least for now. It's hard to say with any certainty what the numbers of Zulu dead were, but estimates usually put the number at around 1,000 killed outright, with a similar number probably dying later of wounds that their herbalists were unable to fix. That would be about 10% of those engaged, and doesn't include those who survived but were too wounded to fight again. While the battle was a victory for the Zulu Impi, it was a victory won at a painful cost, and it was a brutal introduction to the horrors of war against a modern industrial nation. They wouldn't be able to afford too many more victories like this one. A young Zulu boy who visited the battlefield later recalled of the scene. Dead was the horse, dead too the mule, dead was the dog, dead was the monkey, dead were the wagons, dead were the tents, dead were the boxes. Dead was everything, even to the very metals. Historiographical arguments will continue forever about exactly who was to blame for the debacle. All I will say is that hindsight is always 20/20, and which of us could claim that in the same boat with the same intelligence reports, we would have acted any differently to Lord Chelmsford, Colonel Durnford or Pulaine. So that's the end of today's episode about the Battle of Isandlwana. If you enjoyed it, please do help the podcast to grow by sharing the link with friends, writing a review and giving me a follow on social media where I have the handle of @Redcoat History, all one word. Let me know if you have thoughts and comments or just want to say hello, as frankly podcasting is a lonely old business and it's nice to know that someone is actually listening. In the next episode we examine one of the most famous battles of all time, an engagement immortalised in the film Zulu, the Battle for Rorke's Drift. It's a story laced with excitement, bravery, tragedy and ladles full of VCs. I think you'll enjoy it. Until then, I bid you adieu.